My son's fiancée wanted to humiliate me. Until she saw the old burn scars on my arms. Just because I didn't graduate from college doesn't mean you can look down on me, Rob said, his voice hoarse with disappointment as he looked at his son, Ethan, who was adjusting the shiny Rolex on his wrist. Ethan sneered, a cold, distant sound. It's not looking down on me, Dad. It's called reality. Look around. We're in a different world. I can't let your poor past ruin my future. Other day. That past pay for your watch, Rob replied, his voice barely a whisper. And I'll pay you back, with interest, Ethan said, his eyes flicking over his father as if he were an old piece of furniture that needed replacing. Chloe and I have an image to maintain. It would be better for everyone if you tried to blend in a little. Each word felt like a stab, but Rob didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly. Okay, Ethan, you want me to fit in? I will fit in. A promise, a threat, and the beginning of a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? The Uber glided to a stop at the end of a sweeping driveway paved with stones that looked like they'd been plucked from a riverbed and polished for a lifetime. Rob felt like one of them, a rough-edged pebble, washed ashore in a land of smooth, curated perfection. Before him, the Prescott family Scottsdale mansion sprawled under the relentless Arizona sun, a gleaming fortress of glass, white stone, and landscaping so immaculate it looked computer-generated. It wasn't a home. It was a declaration of wealth. He followed the sound of muted chatter and the delicate clinking of glasses toward the back of the house. The air, thick with the dry desert heat, was perfumed with a cloying mix of chlorine and expensive floral scent. The scene was a perfect replica of Chloe's Instagram feed, a shimmering infinity pool that seemed to pour into the distant horizon, a fully stocked outdoor bar helmed by a bartender in a starched white shirt, and clusters of guests draped in expensive linens, all in tasteful shades of beige, cream, and ecru. They looked less like people attending a party and more like accessories chosen to complement the decor. Ethan spotted him first. His son, his boy, emerged from a group, his face a mask of practiced ease. He looked tan and trim in a linen shirt that probably cost more than Rob's entire monthly budget for groceries. Dad, you made it, he said, his smile a little too bright, a little too tight at the corners. Chloe was instantly by his side, a vision in a white sundress that billowed around her ankles. She didn't walk, she floated. Rob, we're so thrilled you could come. Her voice was a perfectly tuned instrument, light and airy. Can I get you something to drink? We have a fantastic local IPA or a really crisp Sauvignon Blanc. A beer sounds great, thanks, Rob said. His voice, by comparison, felt like gravel rolling downhill. He watched as Chloe, with a subtle flick of her wrist, summoned the bartender. It was a gesture of casual, inherited authority. She was an image manager, he realized, meticulously curating not only her own presentation, but that of everyone within her orbit. Her relentless cheerfulness felt like a shield, and beneath it, Rob could sense the low-frequency hum of anxiety. He was soon introduced to a man with a leathery tan and a woman dripping with delicate gold jewelry. So, what do, Rob? The man asked, his eyes performing a swift, dismissive inventory of Rob's department store polo shirt and faded jeans. Before Rob could shape an answer, I own a small safety consulting firm. I help warehouses and small factories keep their people from getting hurt. Chloe's voice cut in, as smooth as silk. Ethan's dad is a consultant, she announced, her smile widening to an impossible brilliance. He specializes in risk management for large corporations. She had taken his modest, practical reality and spun it into something abstract and impressive. The lie was so effortless, so immediate, that it stole the air from Rob's lungs. Their laughter did not ring out. It sparkled like sunlight on the surface of a swimming pool, bright but without warmth. Chloe deftly steered him away before the man could ask for specifics. As they walked, she placed a hand on Ethan's arm. Rob saw it for what it was, not a gesture of affection but of control. An invisible break. He said nothing. He was an observer here, a data collector in a foreign land. His son had chosen this world, and Rob was just beginning to understand the terms of the contract. Later, Rob stood near the edge of the patio, watching Ethan hold court with a group of young men who all seemed to have the same haircut and the same air of unearned confidence. Ethan was showing off a new watch, a gleaming Rolex that caught the afternoon sunday. "A little gift to myself," Ethan said, his voice laced with a casual bravado that was entirely new. "Closed my first big deal last month. Had to mark the occasion." A quiet sadness settled in Rob's chest. It wasn't anger, just a vague, hollow disappointment. He knew about the big deal. He also knew that the seed money that had made it possible had come from his own life savings, transferred without paperwork or fanfare one afternoon in his cluttered garage. It had been an act of blind love. When you see a dream in your child's eyes, you don't think about contracts. You just think about giving them wings. Ethan had never mentioned the money again. And now, standing here, basking in the glow of his friend's admiration, he was learning to lie with his silence. The watch wasn't a symbol of success. It was a testament to his complicity in the grand deception. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the perfect lawn, Chloe clapped her hands together, drawing everyone's attention. "Quick announcement, everyone," she chirped, her arm linked possessively through Ethan's. "As you all know, the annual Prescott Halloween party is practically a national holiday." A wave of appreciative laughter rippled through the guests. She turned her high-beam smile directly on Rob. "It's going to be so much fun, Rob," she said, her tone bright and insistent. "This year's theme is Hollywood Nightmare, so be creative." The invitation hung in the air, weighted with a subtle challenge. Can you, the simple, working-class man, keep up in our world of elaborate fantasy? Rob met her gaze, offering a small, non-committal nod. The vague anxiety he'd been feeling all day began to sharpen, crystallizing into a cold, clear focus. He was alert now, observant. He saw the hairline cracks in the flawless facade of their lives. His son wasn't just marrying a woman. He was marrying into a value system built on pretense. And the Halloween party, he suddenly understood, was not just a party. It was the next act in a carefully staged performance. And he was being handed his script. Rob stood before the mirror in the beige anonymity of his hotel room. The theme, Hollywood Nightmare, felt like a private joke. Hollywood was a place that built dreams out of cardboard and clever lighting. His nightmares were made of soot, steam, and the smell of melting plastic. He had no interest in a costume. Indifference had been his default setting for the party. But now, under the flat bathroom lights, something else was taking its place. He pulled off his polo shirt, exposing his torso and arms. A roadmap of his past stared back at him. His body was a text, each scar a chapter. This shiny, slick patch of white skin on his forearm, the fallen ceiling beam, glowing red at the edges, that rough, puckered skin on his shoulder, the second-story window exploding outward in a shower of superheated glass. Each mark was a ghost. And on that one night, a ghost had escaped him. The memory wasn't a story he could tell, just a chaotic collage of sensation. The roar of the fire, so loud it felt like a physical presence. The blinding heat that cooked the moisture from his eyes. A child's scream, high, thin, and then abruptly gone. He remembered the weight of something small and limp in his arms, the desperate scramble back through the smoke, and the hollow feeling of failure that had settled deep in his bones and never truly left. Burn injuries leave lasting reminders on the body, but the invisible ones etched into the psyche were the ones that truly haunted. One, his phone buzzed on the granite countertop. A sharp, intrusive sound. It was Ethan. "Hey, Dad, you getting ready?" Ethan's voice was strained, unnaturally upbeat. "Just about," Rob said, his eyes still fixed on his reflection. Great. So, listen, Chloe had this amazing idea. She's hired a special effects makeup artist from LA for the party. He does stuff for the movies. She said she booked you a slot to do a zombie face or something cool. It'll be great. The offer hung in the air between them, so absurd it was almost comical. It was another one of Chloe's attempts to control, to manage, to smooth over his rough edges and make him fit the aesthetic of her perfect party. She didn't want Rob. the retired firefighter with his history written on his skin. She wanted a character, a performer. No need, Ethan, Rob said evenly, his voice calmer than he felt. I'll take care of it. But Dad, it's a big party. Everyone's going all out. I know, Rob said, cutting him off gently. I'll be there. 好事的 4. He ended the call before Ethan could protest further. He understood. His son was caught in the middle, trying to appease his fiancée while grappling with a lifetime of loyalty to his father. But the call had solidified something for Rob. A quiet resolution settled over him. It wasn't arrogance that drove his decision. It was wariness. I've spent my life hiding them under long sleeves, he thought, tracing the edge of a particularly jagged scar on his bicep. Tonight, I don't have the strength. This is me. Let it be. He wouldn't play their game. He would bring his reality into their make-believe world. He wasn't choosing to expose painful scars. He was choosing to stop hiding. It was a powerful act of defiance, a refusal to be curated. He would come to their party as himself, a naked truth in a sea of elaborate lies. Ignoring the suit bag hanging on the closet door, he pulled a clean, short-sleeved work shirt from his duffel. It was simple, blue, and utterly out of place for a Scottsdale mansion party. It was perfect. As he buttoned it, leaving the top button undone, his scarred forearms were plainly visible. They weren't a costume. They were his story. He was on his way, a man of stark reality, about to walk into a world of pure fantasy. A confrontation between the unvarnished truth and carefully constructed fiction was about to begin. The party was a maelstrom of calculated chaos. Music with a heavy, synthetic bass throbbed from hidden speakers, and the air was thick with the competing scents of dry ice, champagne, and perfume. Every corner of the Prescott's palatial backyard had been transformed. Fake cobwebs dripped from artfully lit palm trees, and costumed waiters served blood-red cocktails from silver trays. It was a Hollywood nightmare, a playground for the rich, where horror was just another aesthetic to be tried on for a night. Rob arrived and felt the atmosphere shift around him, or rather, felt himself become a dead spot in the glittering energy field. He was a black and white photograph in a world of lurid technicolor. A man dressed as the Joker, his smile a garish red slash, gave him a once-over and sneered. A woman in a slinky Morticia Adams gown simply stared, her expression a perfect blend of confusion and disdain. His simple blue work shirt was a more effective costume than any of theirs. It made him truly terrifying, a real person in a room full of fantasies. Ethan found him almost immediately. He was dressed in a pristine, razor-sharp suit, his hair slicked back, a fake axe held loosely in one hand. Patrick Bateman from American Psycho. The costume was so fitting it hurt. Dad, what are you doing? Ethan hissed, his eyes wide with panic as he tried to pull Rob into the shadows near a monolithic outdoor fireplace. I told you to let the makeup artist do it. Chloe, I'm fine, Ethan, Rob said, his voice a low anchor in a storm of noise. He didn't pull his arm away, but he didn't move either. It was too late. Chloe, a perfect Regina George from Mean Girls in a pink cardigan and with a look of supreme confidence, was gliding toward them, a small coterie of similarly dressed women trailing in her wake. She'd had a few glasses of champagne, and it had sharpened her edges, making her smile brighter and her eyes colder. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze raking over Rob's exposed arms. A theatrical laugh, high and brittle, escaped her lips. She turned to her friends. "Oh my God, you guys, look!" she exclaimed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger. "Look at his scary burn scar makeup. It's so detailed." Her friends tittered, their laughter dying down as they saw the strange stillness in the older man. Their social instincts told them something was off, but they took their cues from their queen. "You really put your heart into the role, didn't you?" Chloe continued, stepping closer. The air crackled. Ethan looked like he might be sick. It almost seems real. I found out they stand with the boss. All around them were fake vampires with plastic fangs, fake zombies with artfully applied latex wounds, and in the center of it all was a beautiful, smiling woman trying to peel the real nightmares from a man's skin. Rob didn't react. He just stood there, his silence a trap she was walking right into. He was no longer hurt. He felt a profound, icy pity. Poor girl, he thought. She is about to have reality slapped in the face. His lack of response seemed to infuriate her. Her pride, already fragile and fueled by alcohol, would not allow her to be wrong. She had declared the scars fake, and now she had to prove it. "Let me show you how fake it is," Chloe announced, her voice dripping with condescension. The moment slowed, time stretching like taffy. He saw the deliberate, almost predatory movement as she closed the final gap between them. He saw Ethan's mouth open in a silent no. He saw her friends' nervous, expectant faces. Then her hand shot out. She grabbed his forearm, her fingers surprisingly strong. "It's just some cheap silicone," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in their circle to hear. Her thumb dug into the rough, raised skin of the scar, her nails scraping against the tissue, searching for an edge, a seam, a place to begin peeling the truth away. The moment Chloe's fingers made contact, the universe of her own making shuddered. There was no cool, pliant give of silicone. There was no slick, artificial surface. There was only the shocking, undeniable reality of human tissue. It was warm, impossibly, livingly warm. And it was rough. A landscape of ridges and valleys, the permanent, unyielding topography of a severe burn. The physical sensation was a raw data point her brain refused to compute. A jolt that bypassed her champagne-fueled confidence and struck something deeper, something primal. From his vantage point of unnerving calm, Rob watched the chain reaction on her face. It was a slow-motion collapse. First, the confident, mocking smile froze, becoming a brittle, grotesque mask. Next, a small, V-shaped frown appeared between her perfectly sculpted eyebrows as her mind wrestled with a sensory contradiction. "Why is it warm?" he could almost hear her thinking. "Why is it so rough?" Her fingers, which had been digging with such purpose, went slack, but they remained on his arm as if paralyzed. Just then, a man dressed as Dracula drifted past, a lit cigarillo held elegantly between two fingers. A faint ribbon of sweet, cloying smoke curled into the air between Rob and Chloe. For Rob, it was just a smell. For Chloe, it was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Her eyes widened. The color drained from her face like water receding from sand, leaving behind a stark, bone-white pallor. The pupils dilated, no longer seeing the manicured Scottsdale backyard, the costumed guests, the shimmering pool. They were seeing something else entirely. A different time, a different place. Rob could see it in her eyes, the ghost of a memory flickering to life. A blur of images. Smoke, thick, black, and choking. The oppressive, suffocating heat. A frantic voice calling her name. And then, an arm, this arm, the one her hand was still resting on, barreling through a splintered door frame, reaching for her through the haze. Her friends, who had been leaning in for the punchline, took a collective, unconscious step back. Their awkward smiles had vanished, replaced by gaping confusion and a rising tide of fear. This was no longer a social slight. It had morphed into something raw and deeply uncomfortable. Ethan stood frozen, a statue of impotent horror, his fake axe looking like a child's toy. The pounding bass of the party music suddenly seemed distant, irrelevant. The world had shrunk to the few inches of space between Chloe's hand and Rob's arm. As Rob looked into Chloe's terrified eyes, the hazy fragments of his own past began to coalesce. The child's scream from his nightmare, the weight of a small body. He had never known what happened to the little girl he'd pulled from the second floor of that house fire 2 decades ago. The family had moved away immediately after, and in the chaos, he'd lost track. He'd carried the memory not as a triumph, but as a failure. He'd gotten her out, but he'd been badly burned in the process and handed her off to another firefighter before collapsing. He'd always felt he'd abandoned her in that final, critical moment. Now, looking at the woman before him, he saw it. Her eyes. He remembered those same wide, terrified blue eyes peering at him through a suffocating curtain of black smoke. Chloe's gaze slowly, mechanically, lifted from the scarred landscape of his arm to his face. For the first time, she was truly looking at him. Not as Ethan's working-class father, not as a social obstacle to be managed, but as the man from her nightmares, the man who was the beginning and the end of her deepest, most buried trauma. The recognition was a silent, shattering explosion. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her perfectly applied lipstick seemed garish against the sudden paleness of her skin. Her hand, still resting on his arm, began to tremble. The music swelled, a wave of synthetic sound crashing against the shore of their profound, terrifying silence. The whole world held its breath, waiting for her first words after the shock. The scream was not human. It was a sound ripped from a place before language, a primal shriek of pure, unadulterated terror that tore through the fabric of the party. The throbbing bass line of the music was instantly neutered. The laughter and chatter choked into silence. Every head turned. In that single, horrifying moment, the Hollywood nightmare became real. Chloe ripped her hand away from Rob's arm as if it were a white-hot coal. Her body recoiled, stumbling backward, her high heels catching on the manicured lawn. She fell, not gracefully, but in a heap of Chanel and trauma, landing hard on the damp grass. The party stopped. 100 pairs of eyes, belonging to 100 fake monsters and villains, were now fixed on the real one. They saw the perfect hostess, the queen of this curated world, broken on the ground, her hands flying to her head as if to hold the splintering fragments of her mind together. Ethan was the first to move, propelled by a surge of pure, confused adrenaline. "Chloe, what's wrong? What's wrong?" he cried, rushing to her side. His Patrick Bateman costume a grotesque parody of concern. He tried to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away, scrambling backward like a cornered animal. Her eyes, wide and wild, were locked on Rob. She wasn't seeing her future father-in-law. She was seeing a ghost. Her breath came in ragged, panicked gasps, and words began to spill out, disjointed and raw, the shrapnel of a buried memory. "That arm," she stammered, one trembling hand gesturing vaguely at Rob. In the smoke, it was so hot, it grabbed me, it pulled me." The crowd, frozen just moments before, began to murmur. A low wave of whispers. What did she say? Is she okay? What's happening? Rippled through the stunned onlookers. Chloe's friends, her Regina George acolytes, hovered uselessly, their faces masks of horror. This was not in the script. And as Rob watched her, as he heard those fractured words, the final, hazy pieces of his own memory slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The address, the frantic call about a child trapped in the upstairs bedroom, the little blonde girl in pink pajamas, her face streaked with soot, her eyes wide with the same terror he saw in them now. He remembered the searing pain as a burning rafter fell, the desperate, one arm dragged to the window, handing her off into the smoke before the world went black. He heard she and her family had moved away. He'd always assumed the worst, carrying the weight of what he believed was a failure. He had saved her life, but he hadn't saved her. But here she was, alive, and about to marry his son. The cosmic absurdity of it was a punch to the gut. Chloe pushed herself up onto her knees, her perfect hair falling in disarray around her face. Her voice, when it came again, was no longer a stammer. It was a piercing, accusatory cry that silenced every whisper. She pointed the trembling finger directly at Rob, the gesture an indictment. "You!" she shrieked, the word echoing across the silent patio. "You're the one who pulled me out of a real fire. Assault on the expect." The declaration detonated in the center of the party. The chaos erupted. A woman gasped. Someone dropped a glass, the smash unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Chloe's parents, a handsome couple in matching Phantom of the Opera costumes, were suddenly there, pushing through the crowd. "Chloe, baby, what is it?" Her mother cried, rushing to her daughter's side. Her father, a man whose face was a permanent mask of stern authority, glared at Rob, then at a paralyzed Ethan. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Ethan couldn't answer. He was a statue in the center of his own family's cataclysm, his face a canvas of disbelief. He looked from his shaking, sobbing fiancée on the ground to his quiet, scarred father, and the carefully constructed world he had built for himself simply ceased to exist. He understood nothing, and in that moment, he was utterly and completely alone. Rob watched the scene unfold. The anger and pity he felt just minutes before washed away by a sudden, familiar clarity. The noise, the panic, the pointing fingers, it all faded into the background. His training, dormant for years, surged to the surface. He wasn't seeing a hostile future daughter-in-law or the architect of his humiliation. He was seeing a victim, a patient, a person in profound distress. Ignoring the accusing stare of Chloe's father and the bewildered gaze of his own son, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. The professional calm in his eyes was more jarring than any shout. The Prescott family was facing a public implosion. Their daughter's deepest trauma laid bare for the Scottsdale elite to witness. But for Rob, the retired firefighter, it was just another fire. And someone had to walk into it. The scream had been a bomb. The aftermath was a fallout cloud of social radiation. The party didn't wind down. It was evacuated. Within minutes, the manicured lawns were a parking lot of departing Mercedes and Teslas. The air filled with the crunch of tires on gravel and the hushed, urgent murmurings of the Scottsdale elite dissecting the scandal they had just witnessed. Rob was not a guest anymore. He was evidence, a piece of a past that had just been violently exhumed. He, Ethan, Chloe, and her parents were ushered away from the prying eyes of the catering staff and into the Prescott family's private library. The heavy cherry panel door closed with a soft, final click, shutting out the world and sealing the five of them in the tomb of opulence and unspoken history. The room, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves of unread leather-bound books and its faint scent of polish and old paper, was designed to project an image of quiet intellectualism. Tonight, it felt like a hospital waiting room, thick with a sterile air of dread. Chloe was a ghost of the woman who had commanded the party an hour earlier. Her Regina George costume was just a pink cardigan on a broken girl. She had curled herself into the corner of a vast leather sofa, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands covering her face. Her body was racked with tiny, silent shudders. Ethan stood helplessly in the middle of the room, his fake axe still dangling from one hand, a useless prop in a drama that had become terrifyingly real. He looked from Chloe's huddled form to his father's stoic silence, and Rob could see the boy, the man, realizing that the beautiful, perfect world he was about to marry into was built upon a foundation of terrifying cracks. Cynthia Prescott, Chloe's mother, was a whirlwind of useless activity. "Tea," she announced to no one in particular, her voice brittle. "I'll put on some tea. Chamomile. It's very calming." She busied herself with an ornate silver tea service in the corner, her hands trembling so much that the clink of porcelain on saucer was a frantic, percussive rhythm in the suffocating silence. It was a desperate, futile attempt to pour normalcy over an uncontrollable situation. David Prescott, however, was not trying to calm anything. He was trying to contain it. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his phantom mask discarded on the mahogany desk, his face a mask of pure, frustrated fury. He didn't look at Rob with the eyes of a grateful father finally meeting the man who saved his child. He looked at him with the cold annoyance of a CEO whose shareholder meeting had just been catastrophically disrupted. The problem was not the past, but its obscene inconvenience in the present. "We agreed, Cynthia," he said, his voice a low, serrated growl directed at his wife. "We agreed we would never speak of this again, for Chloe's sake." The subtext was as loud as the scream had been. "For our sake, for our image." Finally, Chloe lowered her hands. Her face was blotchy, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She wouldn't look at Rob. Her gaze was fixed on the floor as she spoke, her voice a raw whisper that was swallowed by the thick carpet. I'm sorry," she breathed. It wasn't a performance. It was the confession of a shattered soul. "I don't remember. I swear, I don't remember your face. It was just a nightmare, a feeling, the smoke, and an arm." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands again. Rob felt the last vestiges of his anger toward her evaporate, replaced by a grim, professional curiosity. There was a puzzle here, an unsolved case. Her parents' reaction, their immediate and aggressive desire to rebury the story, was not normal. Gratitude was the expected response. This was avoidance. This was guilt. He watched them for a long moment. He was a hero in the story, but he was not the hero in this room. He was a mirror, and they were terrified of their own reflection. His silence was a vacuum, forcing them to fill it with their own discomfort. Cynthia poured tea into cups that no one would drink. David continued his furious pacing. Ethan stood frozen, a spectator at his own life's derailment. After letting the silence stretch until it was thin and humming with tension, Rob spoke. His voice was even calm, the voice he had used 100 times at accident scenes to cut through panic. He didn't look at Chloe. He looked directly at David Prescott, the man who was acting more like a culprit than a father. He asked a simple, direct question that landed in the room with the force of a wrecking ball. So, Rob said, his gaze unwavering, "What really happened that night?" David Prescott stopped pacing. He turned, his face pale, his jaw clenched. He looked cornered. A powerful man suddenly stripped of all his defenses by 4 simple words. The carefully constructed mask of the Scottsdale Titan cracked, revealing the frightened man underneath. The real secret was not that his daughter had been saved from a fire 20 years ago. The secret was the fire itself. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? Rob's question hung in the library's oppressive silence, sucking the remaining oxygen from the room. It was not an accusation. It was a simple request for a truth that had been buried for 2 decades, and its quiet power was more formidable than any shout. David Prescott flinched as if struck. He turned from Rob, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape he knew he wouldn't find. He looked at his shattered daughter, his stunned future son-in-law, his weeping wife. He was cornered by his own history. "This is a private family matter," he finally bit out, the words laced with a desperate, failing authority. "It stopped being private when your daughter screamed it across the backyard," Rob replied, his voice still maddeningly calm. "It stopped being private when she put her hand on my arm." Ethan, who had been a statue of shocked inertia, finally found his voice. It was cracked, fragile. "Dad asked a question, David. I think after all this, we deserve an answer." He looked at Chloe, curled on the couch, and a flicker of protective anger crossed his face. She deserves an answer. That was the final push. The united front of the 2 fathers, one real, one prospective, was a wall David could no longer scale. With a sigh that sounded like the collapse of a building, he walked to the grand, unlit fireplace, a dark maw of brick and soot. He placed his hands on the marble mantelpiece, leaning his weight on them, staring down into the cold ashes as if confronting the ghost of that long-ago fire. "It was a different time," he began, his voice low and defensive, the voice of a man already preparing his legal defense. "I was young, ambitious. My career was just taking off." Rob listened, not to the words, but to the cadence. He didn't hear a remorseful father. He heard a lawyer presenting a settled case, choosing each word to minimize damage, not to admit guilt. "There was a party," David continued, his gaze still fixed on the hearth. "Another Halloween party, ironically. Cynthia was out of town with her mother. I was careless." "How careless?" Ethan pressed, his voice gaining a hard edge. David's shoulders tightened. He was a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "There was another woman there. We were drinking. A jack-o'-lantern on a side table. It had a real candle in it. It was knocked over. It all happened so fast. One minute we were, the next, the curtains were on fire. The smoke, it was everywhere." He spoke in clipped, sanitized sentences, stripping the memory of its ugly, intimate details. He finally looked up, not at Chloe, but at Ethan, a plea for understanding from one man of ambition to another. "I could have lost everything," he said, his voice raw with the memory of his fear not for his daughter, Rob noted, but for himself. "My career, my family, this house, my reputation. The scandal would have destroyed me. So we moved," he said, his voice regaining a measure of control. "We left the city, came here to start over. We hired the best therapist for Chloe, ones who specialized in helping children process trauma through forgetting. We decided that the official story, the one we told everyone, the one we told her, was that It was a faulty wire, an electrical accident. It was simpler for everyone. Chloe let out a small, wounded sound, like an animal in a trap. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with a new, more profound horror. The nightmare wasn't the fire. The nightmare was her entire life. So, she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of the revelation. All these years, it was all a lie? Her collapse was absolute. It wasn't just a repressed memory anymore. It was a realization that the very foundation of her family was a fraud. Her frantic, desperate obsession with creating a perfect life, a flawless image, suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. It was an unconscious attempt to build something real and true on top of a bedrock of deception. She had been trying to outrun a lie she never even knew was chasing her. Ethan stared at David, his face a mixture of shock and pure, undiluted disgust. The man he had admired, the powerful patriarch whose approval he had so desperately sought, was a coward. A selfish man who had sacrificed his own daughter's truth on the altar of his ambition. He looked from David's strained face to Chloe's broken form, and the future he had envisioned, the Prescott name, the power, the prestige crumbled into ash. Cynthia, seeing the judgment in the room, finally spoke through her tears, a weak defense of her own complicity. I was so scared, she sobbed, twisting a silk handkerchief in her hands. Scared of losing all this, scared of raising a traumatized child by myself if he left. I went along with it. Her selfishness was born of fear, not malice, but it was selfishness all the same. The truth, ugly and suffocating, now filled the room. The mystery of the fire was solved, but it had unlocked a deeper, more tragic story. The complete moral bankruptcy of the Prescott family. Rob felt no satisfaction in this victory. There was no triumph in uncovering a truth that so thoroughly destroyed a person. He only felt a deep, aching sadness for the little girl in the pink pajamas. She hadn't just been burned by a fire. She had been systematically burned by the lies of the very people who were supposed to protect her from the world. The family was in ruins. The engagement a smoking crater. Ethan stood in the silence, the weight of an impossible choice on his shoulders. Could he marry a legacy of lies? Could he tether himself to this family, knowing what he now knew? And Chloe, stripped bare of her identity, her history, her confidence, how could she possibly begin to face the morning? The scent of pine and linseed oil was the first thing that greeted Ethan. A clean, honest smell that was the absolute antithesis of the Prescott mansion's cloying perfume of chlorine and anxiety. Rob's woodworking shop was a cathedral of sawdust. Sunlight streamed through high, dusty windows, illuminating the swirling motes of wood that danced in the air. It was a place where things were made, not curated, where raw material was shaped by patient, callous hands into something solid and true. It was a place of authenticity, and Ethan felt like a forgery walking into it. He found his father by the workbench running a piece of sandpaper over the smooth, curved edge of a rocking chair runner. Rob looked up as he entered, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded, wiped his hands on the rag, and gestured to a worn, wooden stool. There was no "I told you so" in his eyes, no anger, just a quiet, waiting stillness. Ethan came empty-handed and with a heart that felt like a lead weight in his chest. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, and the slick-back bravado of Patrick Bateman was gone, replaced by a weary exhaustion that seemed to have settled deep in his bones. He looked like a man who had been running a marathon only to find the finish line was a painted backdrop. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't trying to fix, smooth, or manage anything. He just came to talk. He sat on the stool, the silence stretching between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of a saw from a neighboring workshop. I talked to Chloe, Ethan said finally, his voice raspy. She's a complete mess, broken. She's checked into a facility, someplace that deals with trauma. She wants to get real help, go to therapy. He looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. But I don't know if that's enough. Rob didn't speak. He just continued to listen, his patience, a physical presence in the room, giving his son the space he so desperately needed. I keep replaying it all, Ethan continued. a torrent of confession now that the dam had broken. The parties, the talk about money and appearances, the way her parents, the way they looked at you. It was a game, a performance, and I was so desperate to learn my lines. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Everything I was chasing, the big house, the Rolex, the approval of those people, I realized it was built on a hollow foundation, just like her family. He finally looked up at his father, his eyes pleading for something absolution, advice, an answer. Rob put down the sandpaper and the piece of wood. He leaned against his workbench, his scarred arms crossed over his chest. He didn't offer a single piece of advice. He didn't say, "You should leave her," or "You need to do what's right." He simply looked at the sturdy, half-finished chair beside him, at the neat rows of chisels on the wall, at the solid stacks of oak and maple waiting to be given purpose. "So," Rob said, his voice quiet but clear over the hum of the workshop, "what do you want to build your foundation on, Ethan?" The question was a parable. It wasn't about Chloe. It was about him. It was a question about core values, about the raw material of a life. Ethan was silent for a long time. His gaze followed his father's, drifting around the workshop. He saw the integrity in the dovetail joints of a nearby chest, the strength in the solid legs of the workbench, the honesty in the grain of the wood. This was a world of substance, a world where things were exactly what they appeared to be. He thought of the slick, cold marble of the Prescott mansion, beautiful on the surface but built to conceal a rotten core. He had been so dazzled by the polish that he had never bothered to check the strength of the foundation. He looked up at Rob, and in that moment, his father knew. The anguish in his son's eyes had been replaced by a deep, resonant sadness, but beneath it was a flicker of something new, certainty. "I think," Ethan said, his voice stronger now, "I think I need to build something myself, Dad, from the ground up, start over." He didn't say, "I'm calling off the wedding." He didn't have to. The words "start over" contained the entire painful, necessary truth. It was his first true act of self-authorship in years, a decision made not for Chloe, not for his father, but for the man he finally understood he wanted to become. A quiet, solid warmth settled in Rob's chest, sturdy and reliable as a well-made joint. It wasn't the satisfaction of being right, it was pride. Not because his son had done what he wanted, but because his son, after a long and painful detour, was finally starting to think for himself. He walked over and placed a heavy, dusty hand on Ethan's shoulder. It was the only answer his son needed. The air in Rob's woodshop was a physical presence, thick with the scent of a world being patiently taken apart and put back together. It was a layered fragrance of sharp pine, the sweet, almost cherry-like perfume of freshly cut walnut, and the earthy, foundational smell of linseed oil. It clung to the rough wooden beams overhead and settled in a fine, pale dust over every surface. For Ethan, stepping across the threshold felt like entering a different dimension, one governed by laws of physics and patience, rather than the fickle, treacherous rules of social currency. He had called his father a few days after the implosion of his former life, his voice small and hollow over the phone. "I don't know what to do," he confessed, the 3 words of surrender he hadn't realized he was capable of. Rob hadn't offered advice or platitudes. He just said, "Shop opens at 8. Now, Ethan stood in the doorway, a ghost haunting the edges of his father's solid, tangible world. He wore a pair of new, stiff work boots that felt like costumes. His hands, accustomed to the smooth glass of a smartphone and the cool leather of a steering wheel, felt useless and soft. He watched Rob at the far workbench. His father was working a hand plane down a long plank of walnut, his movements a study in practice economy. There was no wasted energy, just a rhythmic shoosh 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 as a perfect, paper-thin curl of wood peeled away from the board, releasing a fresh burst of fragrance into the air. This was a place where things were made, not just acquired, where value was created through skill and effort, not declared by a price tag. Rob finished his pass, straightened up, and wiped his hands on the worn denim of his jeans. He looked at Ethan, and his eyes held no judgment, no triumphant "I told you so." They held only a quiet, waiting acceptance. He gestured with his head toward a stack of rough-sawn lumber. "We've got a commission," he said, his voice even. "Dining table. Needs to be milled, jointed, and planed before we can even think about the design. There's a broom in the corner. Can start by clearing a space." The broom felt foreign in Ethan's hands. It was an act of profound humility. For years, his life had been about outsourcing, delegating, and leveraging. Now, he was at the bottom, performing the most basic task in the world he didn't understand. As he swept, creating clouds of sawdust that caught the light like swarms of golden insects, he felt a strange sense of unburdening. Each stroke was a small act of erasure, clearing away the residue of his life in Scottsdale. The days that followed were a painful, necessary education. He was clumsy, a liability in the workshop that ran on precision. His hands, uncalloused and weak, blistered and ached. He ruined a perfect piece of maple by misreading the tape measure, the saw screaming off the line in a mistake that cost not just wood, but time. He felt the hot flush of shame, the old instinct to deflect or make an excuse rising in his throat. He looked up, ready to apologize, but Rob just picked up the ruined piece, examined the bad cut, and said, "All right, let's measure again. You hold the board this time. Feel the weight of it." Rob taught by proximity, not lecture. He'd guide Ethan's hand on the chisel, showing him how to feel for the bite of the steel in the wood. He'd have Ethan watch as he sharpened a plain blade until he could shave the hair off his arm, explaining that a sharp tool was a safe tool, an honest tool, that worked for hours in a comfortable, masculine silence, their communication reduced to grunts of effort, the tap of a mallet, the shared glance that said, "It's level." It was in these quiet, focused hours that Ethan began to understand his father, not as a provider or a figure from his past, but as a craftsman. He saw the deep satisfaction Rob took in a perfectly executed dovetail joint, the respect he had for the wood itself, often stopping to trace the path of a complex grain with his fingertips. It was a form of integrity Ethan had never witnessed before, a commitment to making something right from the inside out, for no other reason than that was the right way to do it. One cool afternoon, as they took a break, perched on stools and drinking coffee from stained mugs, Ethan finally spoke of the past. "I got a letter," he said, staring into the black liquid in his cup. "From Cynthia Prescott, Chloe's mother." Rob waited, sending a small block of scrap wood with his thumb. "She and David are separated. She apologized for everything. Said she was sorry for being a coward." He shook his head. "And Chloe, she's in a long-term treatment center in California. Really dealing with it. The fire, all of it." He finally looked up, his eyes clear and sad. "I hope she finds what she's looking for. Peace, I guess." The words held no anger, no trace of the bitterness that had poisoned him for weeks. It was the quiet, resigned sound of a chapter that had been fully, painfully read and finally closed. Rob reached over and placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder, the calluses a familiar, comforting weight. "Me too, son," he said, his voice gentle. "Me too." That was all that needed to be said. The rest was in the sawdust on their clothes and the shared work that lay before them. Weeks later, the table was finished. It stood in the center of the workshop, a magnificent, solid presence. The walnut grain flowed across its surface like a dark, swirling river, alive under the final coat of oil. It was more than a piece of furniture. It was a testament. Ethan ran his hand over the top, feeling the seamless joints, the impossibly smooth finish. It was the first thing in his adult life he had helped build from nothing, and it felt more valuable to him than the Rolex he left in a drawer in his now empty condo. He had found a different kind of wealth in this dusty, fragrant workshop. It wasn't the wealth of acquisition, but the quiet, profound satisfaction of creation. He had learned to respect the raw material, to be patient with the process, and to find value in the quiet, steady application of effort. Rob stood beside him, and for the first time in more than a decade, he looked at his son and saw not a reflection of his own hopes or fears, but a man standing on his own foundation one he had helped build with his own two hands. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of the unspoken truth of their shared work, a bond reforged in the language of wood and time. But as Rob looked at the table, a tangible symbol of a future rebuilt, he felt the echo of his own past. He had helped his son find his way. Now, there was one final echo from the fire he needed to silence for himself. Over 99% of viewers just sat through this story without clicking like or subscribe. Actually, it's easy, just one tap. What time is it in your area, and where are you listening? The Phoenix Fire Academy's parade ground shimmered under a sky of brilliant, pitiless blue. The air smelled of hot asphalt, diesel exhaust from the gleaming red engines parked in perfect formation, and the starched cotton of brand new uniforms. It was a place of beginnings, charged with a potent, combustible mixture of discipline and youthful idealism. Rob stood at a simple metal podium, a slight breeze rustling the pages of a program he had no intention of reading. He felt the familiar weight of a dress uniform on his shoulders, a uniform he hadn't worn in years, but which still felt like a second skin. He scanned the small crowd of dignitaries and family members seated in the VIP section. His eyes found Ethan first. His son sat tall, not with the brittle posture of his real estate days, but with a new, settled confidence. He offered a small, encouraging nod. Next to him, a few seats down, was Cynthia Prescott. She looked smaller without the opulent armor of her Scottsdale life, but her eyes, when they met Rob's, held a quiet, respectful clarity. Theirs was not a friendship, but a fragile truce born from the wreckage of their children's lives, a shared understanding that some things, once broken, could only be mourned, not mended. Her presence was an unexpected grace note in a day heavy with symbolism. Rob gripped the sides of the podium, his gaze sweeping over the graduating class. He saw their faces, young, eager, terrified, proud, and he felt a profound sense of connection, the passing of a torch that was both a burden and an honor. He cleared his throat, and the microphone carried his voice, steady and calm, across the silent field. "Good morning," he began. "First, congratulations. You've survived the drills, the smokehouse, the endless hours of training. You've learned how to read a fire, how to handle a Halligan, how to trust the person next to you with your life. You are, by every technical measure, firefighters." He let the words hang in the dry air. "But your education has just begun, because the hardest lessons aren't taught in the classroom. They're learned in the quiet moments after the sirens have faded, when the adrenaline is gone, and you're left alone with what you've seen, what you've done, and what you've failed to do. They can't teach you how to live with the heat long after the flames are out, and they can't teach you how to live with the scars, both the ones the world can see and the ones it cannot, with a slow, deliberate motion that felt both intensely personal and entirely public." Rob unbuttoned the cuffs of his uniform and rolled his sleeves up past his elbows. He held his arms out, turning them in the harsh, revealing sunlight. The complex, puckered map of his past was laid bare. He heard a few soft gasps from the audience. "For most of my life," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I saw these as marks of failure. They were a testament to a single night, to a fire where I wasn't fast enough, a floor that gave way too soon. They were a brand of my own inadequacy." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the young faces before him. "Others," he continued, "will see them as something else. They might see them as a costume, something to be mocked, or they might see them as something ugly, a nightmare to be hidden away so we can all maintain the illusion of perfection." He let his arms drop back to his sides. "They are all wrong. These scars are not medals of heroism, and they are not marks of shame. They are simply the truth. They are proof that we are vulnerable, that we can be broken, that we will not always win. They are a reminder that the price of walking into the fire is that you will, inevitably, get burned. But they are also proof of something else," he said, his voice rising with a quiet, powerful conviction. "They are proof that we can survive. They are the story of our healing. They are the legacy that says, I was there, I was hurt, but I am still standing. And that lesson is the most important one you will ever learn. Your true legacy," he concluded, looking directly at the graduates, "won't be measured in the size of the fires you extinguish or the commendations on your wall. It will be in the quiet courage you show on the days you want to quit but don't, It will be in the compassion you offer to a stranger on the worst day of their life. It will be in how you learn to carry your own history without letting it consume you. That is your sacred duty. Carry your truth, carry your scars, wear them proudly. They are the most honest uniform you will ever own. He stepped back from the podium into a profound, ringing silence. Then the applause started. It wasn't the polite, scattered clapping of a formal ceremony. It was a roar. It was a wave of sound that rolled across the field. A raw, emotional acknowledgement from a generation of young men and women who understood they had just been given a compass for the difficult road ahead. Later, as families embraced and cameras flashed, a young woman with a sharp, intelligent face and her new badge pinned proudly on her chest approached him. "Captain Miller," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "My dad, he was on the job for 30 years. He never once talked about it, about the hard calls. He just held it all in." "Thank you," she said, her eyes welling up. "Thank you for giving us permission to be human, for showing us that scars can be a kind of strength." Rob looked at this young firefighter, at the fierce hope in her eyes, and felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling of a circle finally, truly closing. He took her offered hand, his scarred one clasping hers. "Just look out for each other," he said. As she rejoined her proud family, he stood for a moment, the desert sun warm on his face. He looked at his arms, at the skin that told the story of his life, and he felt no shame, no regret, only a deep, quiet acceptance. The ghosts of the fire were finally at rest. He had passed the torch.